Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and today I'm going to do a live stream about uncertainty. Now, this is something that I think many of us have been going through for the past 2 years. And now, just when we think we've got to figure it out, another thing gets layered on top of things. So, today I want to talk about how do we deal with VUCA, VUCA. That stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I could safely say that we all have that in our lives to some degree or another. So, what I'd love you to share today are a couple of things. First of all, share where you're coming from. Would love to know where you are. And then also, what do you feel most uncertain about these days? I mean, there are so many things that are happening to us. Is it about where what your workplace is going to look like? Is it about what kind of work will you actually be doing? Is it about the health issues that are going on? Are we going to be able to continue with our normal lives or not with this continued pandemic? And we're hearing now that it's moving into being a pandemic to being endemic, like the seasonal flu. What does that mean for our lives? How do we prepare for this? So, today I want to talk about how we deal with all of this uncertainty, especially as leaders, because we are often called upon to be these leaders who know what the answers are, who have certainty, who can tell us and simplify the complex and to make concrete the ambiguous. And we don't have the answers. I mean, that's the reality is that oftentimes we don't know really what's going on. So I want to introduce this incredibly powerful tool called scenario planning. And the beauty of this is that it really allows you to look at all the different ways that the future could unfold. And I find it to be so incredibly powerful because in the end, we as leaders can't be frozen by VUCA. We have to be able to go out there and be able to deal with all the uncertainties that are out there and at least be able to have some sort of approach so that we could figure out with our teams together what the answer should be. So I have a couple things. We have Peter coming in from Scotland in the UK near Ireland. Ricardo, thank you for joining, Peter. Ricardo coming in from Mexico City. So great to hear from you. And Nigel coming from Nigeria, from Lagos. So thank you so much. Very, very diverse and very international. So thank you for joining today. Again, I would love for you to share if you feel comfortable, just what are you feeling uncertain about? What's weighing on your mind? And even just what are some of the decisions that you're having to make and you're grappling with? Do I do this? Do I do that? Do I invest? Do I divest? Do I hire somebody or not? And I find that scenario planning can be useful in all of these situations. So I'm going to be sharing some content and then a little bit about what you could actually do to make scenario planning come to life. So I'm going to be a little bit academic today and share with you some slides. And if you go back way back into my live streams, I did a similar thing right at the very beginning of the pandemic with my friend Doug Randall. And what I want to show is just some slides that he used, and he's from a group called Trium. And it's absolutely fantastic what they do. So they have this scenario planning. I'm going to use a different layout here so you can read all of it. So the way that scenario planning works is that it's very different than traditional planning. So traditional forecast-based planning says, for example, you're looking at your budget for the year and you're saying how much you're going to spend next year. And so you figure it's going to be a deviation of maybe 10% from normal. And so this is the way we usually do planning because it's what happened in the past is probably going to happen in the future with a few changes. And that doesn't work in a world with a lot of VUCA. And I would say that's the world that we are living in today. So, how do you actually do scenario planning? Well, I think one of the ways to do that is, in particular, to think about using scenarios. And that is when we don't know what the future is going to look like. Um, and we know we have to make a decision. Again, this is the key thing is scenario planning and decision making together. You want to start putting together all these different scenarios. And scenarios are the case where you're figuring out, okay, what's one really extreme outcome? What's another one? Develop a few, not a dozen, just two, three, four at the max. And the reason why this is so useful is that you're starting to piece apart all of that complexity. You're trying to simplify it down into a couple key scenarios. to help you drive your decision making. And the reason why this is so important is that in the end, what you're going to do is figure out if it's going to be if this scenario unfolds in scenario number one, then what would we do about that? If instead it's scenario number two, what would we do about it? And if it's number three, four, etc. And you're developing these really, really robust strategies as a result. And the reason why I think this is so incredibly powerful is that instead of trying to figure out every single scenario that could possibly happen and all the small little permutations, you're putting together just one really extreme scenario, and then you're figuring out what would we do there. And here's the key. Once you know what all of your robust strategies are for each of those scenarios, then you can look at the actions that you would take for the most common situations. What are the common tactics you would take? So, for example, I know some companies, excuse me a second, I'm suffering from allergies out here in California. If one of the things that you are thinking about, some of the things that quite a few companies did before the pandemic, is they said, we're going to have a remote working strategy because we're here in California, we have earthquakes, for example, or we have a lot of people traveling, or whatever the scenario is, we may just need to be able to go and be remote very quickly. So they developed that scenario and they said, what would we take to prepare for that? If there was a natural disaster, if people had to work remote, how do we keep our business going? So they figured out those things and they started putting out all the scenarios of what that could look like, developed a very robust strategy and put it into action. So when the pandemic hit, they already had a plan. They just literally took out that folder and activated it. They already had the technology in place. They had some basic training. Of course, it wasn't completely in place. No one's completely 100% for scenarios like, are you going to work at home for the next year or two? But they had the foundation so that they could quickly switch their companies. And these companies did extremely well at the very beginning of the pandemic because they were prepared. So how do we think about all of these scenarios and prepare for them? Well, one of the things that Trium Group, and I really like the work that they've done around scenario planning, and they even have one of the things that they've done is, let me just find it, is they have a scenario planning toolkit that you can go and download. So I just put a short code for it for bit.ly, bit.ly/scenario-toolkit. And you can go and download that. It's a really robust, beautiful toolkit that was developed by Doug Rando at the Trium Group. And I think it's still one of the best tools that are out there for scenario planning. So if you're curious about how to do this, all I can say is just go download it. It takes you step by step by step how to actually develop the scenarios and make decisions off of it. And just to give you an idea, this is the scenarios that they developed at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it's so interesting to go back and look at these now. So, for example, they said maybe one scenario would be that there would be a gradual recovery. We would slowly recover from the pandemic. And that's sort of what happened in 2020. They had another scenario that would be fits and starts, that different health or pandemic or different things would actually you would start making progress and then you go back. And for me, that's exactly what it feels like. The perfect storm is that everything just collapses, goes back to the recession of 2008, 2009. Clearly, that's not what happened. And then the fourth scenario, very optimistic scenario, is that the world comes together, we figure this out, everybody gets the vaccines all around the world, and we come together into a new togetherness. Clearly, that has not happened. So it's interesting to go back now and look at these scenarios that Trium developed. And what's so interesting is that back in April of 2020, we didn't know what the world would look like. But having these four scenarios developed and then having clear strategies for each and every single one of these gave you at least a direction to start thinking of. And then this is the key. You want to look at the common points across all of them. And if there's anything that's common that will prepare you for every single one of these scenarios, then you go and do them. You should just go do them. No questions asked. And that will give you that first step. And then you, as time goes on, you figure out, well, which of these things are starting to develop? very early on, it was clear that the great correction wasn't going to happen. So we can take that scenario off and lessen it, maybe still have that there, but not take those actions as much into consideration. But we could see that it was somewhere going to be between fits and starts, perfect storm, gradual recovery. So now what are the next actions we would take? And this is the key thing. What are the indicators? What are the triggers that you are going to look for that will give you indications that one scenario is developing over the other? And so therefore, you wanted to take those actions according to those strategies. Which one of these are you going to be looking at and saying, okay, I can see that this is happening now? That's going to tell us that we need to start activating this strategy more quickly than the other things that we may be preparing for. And I find this to be so helpful because, again, you're not trying to make a decision early on about what's going to happen because you don't know. But as the future unfolds, you can begin to now take action to say, okay, I feel more confident now that this is the right direction. And then if things change again, you can know that wasn't the way the future was unfolding. We're going to go back over here. Now, I talked last week and the week before about how we make decisions. And one thing in particular, as leaders, we don't like having to go back on decisions. We don't like saying, sorry, wrong decision. We need to go in the other direction. But when we're talking about the future, that is the reality. We don't know what's going to happen. We're going to make the best decision right now with the information that we have because we must make a decision. And we'll be so much better off making that decision right now and seeing what unfolds than taking no action. Our, our need as leaders to always be right, to be 100% perfect, is going to hold us back tremendously in times of VUCA. And so we need to be able to set that aside, do these scenarios, develop the robust strategies, look for those signals and those trigger points to tell us that one scenario is developing more likely, it has a greater likelihood of developing than the others, and start moving in that direction. But if the indicators say, no, it's this way instead, then we need to be ready to be able to switch. This adaptability, this ability to deal with flux, I think is the biggest area of development for many leaders because we don't deal well with that. We are oftentimes thinking that our roles are to stabilize things, to operationally get things to the point where things are operating really well. And that's great. That's a role of a leader in many ways to create those processes. But then you're moving into the management territory. You're a manager, not necessarily a leader. We need leaders during times of great change to step forward and make these difficult decisions. And so I do think that scenario planning is an incredibly helpful area to be thinking about and using. All right, we got a lot of comments here, so I just want to see. So Jay is saying, one of the biggest uncertainties that he's dealing with is how our political climate will impact business. Absolutely, because there's so much division right now and so much uncertainty, especially in the US with midterm elections. We have international conflicts like what's happening in Ukraine happening. How is that all going to impact our businesses? So we have no idea how we're going to do it. Let's see, Peter is saying, seize the day, paying it forward for a long number of years makes decisions easy. So I think I understand that by looking far in advance, looking it forward and paying it forward, that's going to really help too as well. And Oscar, thank you so much for joining from Kenya, from Nairobi, one of my favorite cities. All right, so one of the things I do want to say is that, if you're thinking about how to actually do this, how to actually do scenario planning, I think, again, I talked about some of those basic things about developing the scenarios, identifying very, very robust strategies for every single one of those, and then seeing how those indicators come about and updating your scenarios and your planning accordingly as you see the future unfolding. Now, one of the questions I get oftentimes is, who has the time to do this? Who has the time to sit down and develop not just one strategy for the business, but multiple ones for the business? The reality is that when you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, you have to develop alternative strategies, plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. And the only way you're going to develop those, if you're going to be a responsible leader, leading in these times of change, is to set aside that time. And the tendency and our natural inclination is to be kind of do that on a superficial level. And so my first comment here is to do it at a robust level. And I use that word very specifically, robust. It's not just like, well, we'll just kind of, do this and we have some ideas sketched on a piece of paper. For example, those organizations that plan for remote working had detailed strategies of how they would actually put in plan if a natural disaster happened, if something disrupted everything that they did, they had a detailed plan how they would activate people working remotely. And they were able to activate that very quickly when the pandemic hit. They had laid the foundations. They could literally go in and pull out that file with that and tell everyone else, pull out that file. We're going to activate this plan, remote working plan. So that's robust. It's really figuring out how would you actually do things? Who would be responsible for what? What technologies do you have as a baseline to be able to make this happen? What are the communications even that you would put out there? And of course, you would do this only for strategies, for scenarios that you think could possibly happen. You're not going to do it for black swans, things that could never happen. But you're working in remote working, looking back, it was something that we could see again, organizations that were prepared for this were in a great position to do that. The other thing I would say is to start using scenario planning with smaller uncertainties. So you may be looking and dealing with a few questions that are going on in your business. So, for example, you may be looking at making an investment or a decision around a hire. And so using a little bit of scenario planning in a very light way is a great way to tip your toe into figuring out, well, what are the scenarios that could happen? What are my hiring plans going to look like? What if my investment plan into this new product or into buying a business works out or doesn't work out? And what are the scenarios that would determine what that would look like? And getting good at using scenario planning for smaller decisions, smaller uncertainties is a great way to begin using this tool so that when it comes time to doing the bigger strategic plan and you're looking at bigger scenarios for longer term planning and longer uncertainties, you have at least that bit of practice earlier on to get yourself comfortable with the entire process. The other thing I would say is to practice really good postmortems. Again, one of the interesting things in looking at the TRIUM work is especially if you did that work 2 years ago, how did it work out? Was your scenario planning robust enough? Did you make the right calls at the right places to be able to understand? And how could you go back and do things differently? I mean, when you look at those scenarios that TRIUM developed, again, this is back in April of 2020. It was incredibly prescient of how they saw the world. And again, that comes from them having a tremendous amount of practice developing and implementing scenario planning. So to get better at this, you need to go back and see what worked and didn't work, and then refine your process for scenario planning. The third thing is to be really clear, and this is what I have found. You may develop it's to be very clear about the signals, about those trigger points that give you an indication of what scenario is actually unfolding. I've seen some organizations develop these beautiful scenarios and develop great strategies, beautiful strategies, each of them. And then they kind of set it in a drawer and didn't think about it anymore. They didn't actively go through and say, what are the trigger points? What are these signals that we need to listen to very, very closely to understand which scenarios are going to be unfolding? So it's really important to understand what those signals are, to put in place the processes on a daily basis, monthly basis, to be able to gather that information from wherever it might be inside of your organization or outside of it in the environment, and be able to bring it back so that you're looking and saying, are these things changing? Are these indicators changing that give us an idea of how the future is unfolding? Because you want to be constantly revisiting this to say, how is it working? Let's look at our scenarios. Do this on a regular basis, quarterly, monthly, weekly, whatever the pace of change is that you're looking at, and really understand how is that future unfolding and then update everything. And this is when people start losing, like, how do I do this? How do I have the time to do this? again, as a leader, and this is my first and last, the most important part, my last point. This is your job. This is your job as a leader to figure out what this future is going to look like. Because if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? Is your board going to be thinking about all of the scenarios and the trigger points? Is it your other leaders who may or may not be doing scenario planning? You're counting on them to make these calls. If you're like a middle manager or frontline manager, you're the person in the end that has to make these calls. And that's what leaders do. They step into the void of indecision when nothing's happening. And you make the call. You make the decision to take action and create change. Because that's what leaders do. So this is I think the biggest challenge for all of us, which is how in the end do we make not just any decision, but really good decisions? And we can't be frozen by analysis paralysis and not make the decisions. And I think that scenario planning is an incredibly powerful tool to be able to go and figure that out. Okay, just a couple other to be here. I think one of the things that Peter is also saying that he does to prepare is to read the right books, and you will have the knowledge and the fact that things are made to happen when you're going to be able to make those decisions happen too as well. So I think in the end, what I would just end here with is, think about how the future is unfolding. And when you are unsure about how to make a decision, use scenarios, use the strategies that you can develop around these scenarios to be able to help you untie all that complexity and ambiguity, to put some certainty into a very uncertain world, and to look at volatility as not something that can't be that you can't do anything about, but something that you can actually put some strategies and some incredibly powerful tools against to be able to help you understand how things are going to be changing. So that's what I have for today. A couple other quick things I wanted to share with you. I do have a new podcast out. If you'd like to be able to see that. Oh, I haven't updated that, but I do have a new podcast out. And it is called The New Rules of Disruption. So ignore the new episodes coming out in January. I have a few ones coming out this month with some interviews with people. So the New Rules of Disruption are me talking about some of the foundational ideas about how I think about disruption and how our roles as leaders are changing because of our ability to deal with this disruption. So what are the new rules that we have to follow as leaders and as organizations to be able to deal with disruption? And I also just want to, again, just talk about where the scenario planning toolkit is available at bit.ly/scenario-toolkit. Again, a beautiful tool that you can look at. And then next Tuesday, on February 8th, I'm going to be talking about, let me try to get this up, about the contradiction between excellence and operational excellence and innovation. I was recently working with a company, and again, very operationally focused, and they're going through a huge transformation in their business model. And so those same leaders are now being asked to innovate. So the question that kept coming up again is, everything we do is around operational excellence to get rid of uncertainty. And now you want us to basically innovate, blow up our old business model and innovate. How do we do both of them at the same time? I mean, literally, how do you change the wheels on the bus as it's rolling? Or as somebody said, we're flying airplanes. How do we take the wings off and put them on again while we're in the air? And that's what it feels like oftentimes. And I'll be talking about how to actually do that. Some of the best practices I've seen of people doing this, and how, frankly, this contradiction is actually something that needs to live in synergy with each other. So we're exploring that topic next week. Until then, I wish you all the best dealing with all the uncertainty, the complexity, ambiguity, and volatility that are in our lives. I wish you peace of mind around making these decisions. They're tough decisions, but in the end, that's what we are called to do as leaders, to make these decisions that nobody else feels capable of doing. And it is such a gift that you step into that void and make those tough decisions and make those calls. So all the best to you, and all the best to you in your leadership for the next coming week. And I'll talk to you next week. Thanks.